is a container, okay, if space is a container, that's the axiom. It's empty, and it exists in advance of everything else. And bodies, this is a perfectly legitimate materialism, because what we have here are physical bodies filling empty space, and some bodies are going to fill more space. But what we have there is the assumption that the empty space is in advance of the bodies, and what we're talking about is always objects that can be quantified. And that seems to run amok in most of our conversation, which is about values, which is about death, which is about new life, forgiveness, repentance, our goals. Those all can be talked about in a rather spaceless vocabulary in terms of an empty space. And I think what the Hyletic does is relate then the theme of space as space making, as creating a horizon of enabling possibilities, as the advantage of that comes out that if we see that there's I forgot the beginning of my sentence, but we have this the Hyletic challenges the notion of empty space, and it suggests also the antinomies or the paradoxes of the view of empty space in terms of its infinite divisibility. And if it's divisibility, then it points more properly to a realm of potentiality, which itself isn't in space, but makes possible spaces. So there are two levels in which to respond to that, I think, Jeremy. And it's a really good question, but I think that the space itself is not without its own, Newtonian space is not without its own conceptual problems. Secondly, it's quite divorced from the kind of conscious life we live, where it doesn't play a role at all unless we reduce our life to the reductionist world of the physicist.
I'd like to say something about what we're talking about. And this is probably maybe my own problem. But I don't know, in the last 20 or so years, of course, I've been trained as a physicist, no apologies there. I don't know, my understanding of, I don't know what I mean by all of this. I don't even know what it means to be real anymore. It just seems to me that our world, that the world, if there is such a thing, is so imaginative that I can't fix on one. I can't put them all together. It seems to, and in fact, Jim mentioned reductionism. Reductionism seems to be the saying is there is only one world and it's this one. And maybe I've become too postmodern, but it just seems to me that that the world is robust, and so robust that I don't know if I can place limits on it. And so my life in the last 20 or 30 years has been trying to understand, to become a Christian, and that means to try. And I don't know what that means, and I see the resistance of our world to it. And I mean the very basis that we take the world to be given as. It's like Schutz's primary reality, the working world. Somehow or other, we're working from some base, and that's how we're supposed to manufacture or construct this Christian world. And I am opposed to that. I'm not sure that I think that our world is so opposed to all but this one reductionist view of this dead universe, that it's where we start from, that it's like it puts a stranglehold on everything else. and it kills us. And so I reject that notion. I simply reject that you can't build on it. You can include it somehow, but you can't start as its base. And so this idea of what is real is extraordinarily confusing to me. I can't even talk to atheists anymore because I don't know where to find a place to talk to them about what's real and not real. It's just so confusing to me. And yet I think they're all sort of, I don't know, I can't explain it. This is what phenomenology is partly trying to do, but I have a feeling that we'll never get there. We'll never get to this, what it is that makes a world, that makes, I don't know, I can't explain it. It just, to me, it's, I'm done. I can't explain it. It's just wild to me. And it's discomforting because you don't know how to talk to other people who are supposedly have different perspectives. When I come to them, I say, I'm not even sure what my perspective is. That's all I want to say.
Well, I have something to say about that. But I think I want to say hooray in a way, because you've opened the door to a concept, seems to me, that leaves nothing out. If you're finding reality to be a problem, still you would seem to acknowledge that there's something there. You're acknowledging that you're conscious. And you're acknowledging that of which you're conscious perplexes you, but there's no doubt that you're conscious, and you're confronted with a massive buzzing, booming confusion, but it's all manifest there. Let's start there. Let's talk about that which you are now experiencing leaves nothing out. And if it's going to make sense eventually, it's because it's going to somehow fit into this realm of manifestation. And we can, being skeptical, but it doesn't seem helpful. But now we can focus, however, as our physicist confreres do, on bodies. A body that would be there, as Shaler would point out, and as Lassen would point out, in one way, because it resists my will and resists my bodily walking through it. That's a distinction. Now, it doesn't mount to reality, but it's a way of talking about something in a fairly clarifying way. And then we can see that it's in space. It is in the sense that there are other things that are around it, and we can start applying numbers to all those things. But then we can start talking about the difference, the way what's manifest, say, as a string quartet, however, doesn't look like a physical body. Nor does the ecstasy of being in love, or the delight you have after a good meal, or of an orgasm. These are all things we have different words for, and we would be surprised if someone thought they all meant the same thing. But they're all manifest, and they're all manifestations. Let's call it a being. Let's use that word being here. And we want to develop to bring it together now, an honorific sense of being, which would be that which, as far as I can see at the moment, cannot not be true. And what certainly manifestness cannot not be true. But there are other things. My consciousness cannot not be true or be. Now, but the things that then we make all sorts of distinctions, bring in the whole Husserlian arsenal of filled and empty intentions, or consciousness is a form of intending something. But I'm clear about, say, your face now. I'm clear about you're wearing glasses, but I have no idea what kind of underwear you have on.
Thank you.
or any scars you have on your body, you know. But I believe you have another side, you know, even though it's absent from me. And there are lots of realities that I get at only through their being absent. But they're only absent by ways of their being present too. And then now we have the issue of time. And you're an expert on time now. And so we have this thing that it's there, but it isn't there. In what sense isn't it there? And even if it endures, if it persists in time, it seems to be a jumble of presence and absences. But the number 4 isn't like that. It doesn't seem to be the sort of thing. My presencing of the number 4 might well be a mix of jumble of presence and absences, but the number 4 doesn't seem to be the sort of thing like bodies that I experience. The number 4.
Let me just make one comment about what you're counseling. I understand, and it certainly has some historical tradition to it, and that is some sort of minimalist approach. In fact, it's how the modern science began in attempting sort of a more minimalist metaphysics to try to say is to be committed to as little as possible. But the problem is, for me at least, is this urge for a world, the desire for a world. That means some sort of completed world, which is a religious urge. And so you just can't have these basic things, these things you can be sure about. There's got to be something much, like the Agatha, what's the name of that cathedral in Istanbul? It's got to be something like that. That's the kind of world that we all want to live in, no matter what it is. It has to be larger than these things you can be sure of.
I don't think Jim is talking about minimalism. I think he's talking about a starting point.
Right.
And as soon as he says being, then that could be the cathedral.
That doesn't leave anything out. There's nothing, there's only thing outside of being is nothing.
That really is a buzzing thing.
Well, yeah, and I think we live in a buzzing, booming, whatever it is of confusion oftentimes, but I would dare say, you couldn't get out of bed if that's all you had.
Right.
You couldn't distinguish your legs from your nose. I mean, the world comes pretty well fleshed out, but the world itself is a complex. The concept of the world, say, alahosro, that we frame things. We willy-nilly, we have backgrounds and foregrounds. We have what we focus on and that which is in the background, the field, the margins, the fringes, as James would say. But there is there an absolute fringe? Is there an absolute background? Well, we usually use that word cosmos from antiquity. But you're already talking about empty intentions. Even if we know about Mars, we don't know right now if we got the telescope the other side of Mars. Well, if we get a telescope on the other side of Mars, we know two sides of Mars. But even if we had 1 million telescopes on Mars, we still don't know what's in Mars, inside of Mars. There's an inner horizon too, not only external horizons. And Mars is just Mars after all, And so there's the moon, and there's the Earth, and there's Pluto, and there's Jupiter. And so, but that's all part of your sense of being. And that's as close as Husserl seems to get somehow to world, or to being when he talks about world as the absolute horizon. But the absolute horizon is essentially an empty intention.
So in Husserl's notion of world, is there a sense of coherence? In other words, that there's something holding this together.
That's true. That's cosmos. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's good. And that is, however, is that to be defined primarily in terms of physics and astrophysics?
That's my problem. And that's my problem.
Yeah, this is what Husserl, I think, did very well in The Crisis. He showed the absurdity of thinking that we live in the world of physicists. You know, and it's as absurd as the Galilean world. So I think that but there is a dogma that the world is right now, just as we know what thought is only by consulting brain scientists and neurophysiologists. There's a public contamination, or I'm sorry, a crippling illness of materialism, because that is the primary. If you want to know what an expert tells, if you want to know on the public view, kind of public doctrine, the Volksgeist today, the really real is what the scientists tell you about it. And that,
even if they don't live that way.
Even though they don't live there, and nor is it a consistent. There are lots of things they can't put into that world, namely consciousness, without destroying it.
Or science itself.
Or science itself. Very good. Where is the law that you have to verify? And what does verify mean unless it's true? And where does truth come up as an object of science? Or does verification come up as an object of science? It mandates, it requires it, it's imperative to verify. But verification is not among the things it studies, or the absolutely obligatory character to be interested in the truth. Anyhow, that wasn't your problem. Your problem was the buzzing, booming confusion. But it still is. It still is. Manifestation is where we begin.
Well, I'm going to use this expression from Kierkegaard. I think it's from Sickness Unto Death, that I keep hearing as I'm reading Conrad-Martius and other people. It's this notion of the self as movement about a spot.
That's what?
That movement about a spot.
Movement about a spot.
Yeah. And I keep hearing this, I don't know if he invented that term, but it keeps showing up in all sorts of places. And that's sort of what I think we're trying to describe here. There is a spot, which means something that's settled, but at the same time, much that is unsettled. But you need both for life. You need both the settled and the unsettled.
No.
And to try to remove all the unsettled is a totalitarian, tyrannical notion that will only end up in death. And yet, to have it all unsettled is just buzzing, and you have nothing. You don't know what to do. That's where we are today. We're just spinning our heads. And
well, the unsettledness is a phenomenological category. If it's settled, we have given it a determination. We can say it has lines, it has a profile, it has delineation. But we never have we don't have that determinateness except as the penumbra, the fringe, the margin of the indeterminate. But the indeterminate is different, has its own distinction between the seemingly absolute indeterminate, which would be a radical skeptical view, but the things calling for determination, which was also called the determinable. The things are there as potentially determinable, as potentially determinate, and we call that the determinable. But that's in a matter of experience. That's where Husserl says we're the true positivists, because we are looking at what's given, the givenness, and we see the givenness is surrounded by the potentially given. And we wouldn't have merely given unless we had that horizon, unless we had that fringe, unless we had that field, unless we had that background. That beckons us to infinity, of course, and that gets us woozy and dizzy and so forth. But that makes us have a science of perspectives. Instead of just talking about everything and being a perspective, we could say, what is a perspective? And then we start saying that at least if everything is a perspectival, at least we can have a science of perspectives. We can't know everything, but we can know what it means to know something and not know something else.
Hey, Jim, when you start talking that way, there's this theme that you bring up from Otto, for instance. I mean, this is just one instance of this term, as well in Levinas. I mean, maybe the stakes are different in different thinkers, but the wholly other, you know, the category of the completely or wholly other, as in Otto, comes up. And this corresponds to a kind of like something implied by horizon shifts, as you call it, on page 211. Maybe I'll share the readings so that we can see it together, because I think this is an important theme to bring up. And while this is up, maybe we should like kind of go into it in order as well in a moment. But so up here, the paragraph that begins Eliade, you mentioned these horizon shifts. You know, I think this is the kind of you know, non-local place of being unsettled that we find when we hit the periphery, and it all starts booming and buzzing again, as it does prior to that consistency of a cosmos, you know, when it's just this heavenly, you know, Uranus of just like hyletic happenings, before we place it in order, and everything becomes the order, the world order, the ordinary life world that we experience on a daily. You know, there are these horizons, and when we experience these horizon shifts, as in a case of like you say just before this, I think that probably the best example is awakening from a dream, or having a conversion experience to a new position or a new lifestyle, like in religious conversion, or even when we just experience a work of music or a piece of literature, or we get absorbed into you know, some new episode of some show we watch, you know, whatever it is, even the enchantment of words and symbol. This is all you know, entering, although still ordinary, a domain heterogenous to the world described by any particular normative domain of science that can be described, you know. So there are these horizons, and we experience these shifts all the time, and they imply, I think this is what you were talking about a moment ago, when you said a science of perspectives. They imply a horizon. Here it is, somewhere right here, a horizon which includes all other horizons, as the limit horizon. There it is, with a capital W, world, you know, as opposed to a multiplicity of worlds, a distinction that will be going into the next chapter, you say in a footnote here. So anyway, this idea of like a horizon of all horizons, and this radical concept of like the world center, you know, being a kind of center of all centers, it really begs to me, and maybe this comes up in the topic of Hans Voss's spheres in the next chapter, the possibility of an all-encompassing horizon. You know, it could be that that's the place of God in this kind of thinking, but you know, this idea of, you've heard me talk about this before, maybe all of you, I talk about this a lot, this idea of the infinite sphere, the pseudo-hermetic, but also the ancient Greek Neoplatonic sphere of the all one, and a corresponding, like in Plotinus, center of all centers, this radical idea of the one that we can find in Plotinus. You know, I don't know if that's exactly what you mean by a science of perspectives, but knowing that there are a multiplicity of horizons, of worlds, implies the possibility of, you know, like an infinite horizon that contains all the horizons. So, I mean, for me, that's a concept of the divine. I mean, it is in the idea of the infinite sphere for Nicholas of Cusa, for the Book of the 24 Philosophers that he draws from, the famous God is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and periphery nowhere. You know, so when I'm reading this, when you talk about the sky heaven in contrast to the earthly realm, you know, that's how that's how I'm thinking. I don't know, what can you talk a little bit about what you think about this idea of like the infinite sphere or horizon of all horizons? It's implied here at this point in the reading. You know, it's just not thematic in that way. And I don't think it's thematic in the next chapter either. And I'm curious why you don't go there. You know, since we're talking about the very generalities of like noetics and making distinctions and manifestations and actualizations and hyletic's and potentialities, possibilities, horizons, you know, the penumbra of what appears in the light of consciousness. You know, it just seems like the limit of where you would go.
I guess just as a footnote, the notion of an absolute horizon as a theological notion, which is at least a indirect reference to God, say in Christian theology, but it's implicit certainly in someone like Paul Tillich, who I was blessed to be able to hear at Chicago many years ago, because he would speak of the unconditioned condition of all conditions, or something like that, you know. And Karl Rahner deliberately uses the phenomenological notion of horizon to refer to God. We have a pre-grasp of being, and because being leaves nothing out, the ultimate source of being is implied for that. And then when we have these what we call religious experiences, or these moments of grace, where you receive all horizons are encompassed in this one moment, which just has to be discontinuous or heterogeneous to all other moments. That is the way that a way of talking about mysticism, or the kind of evidence that enables faith to happen. The reason I balk Randy a little bit about the bringing in the Neoplatonic, or this, I think, for example, of Nicholas of Cusa, that was clearly a metaphor. There's something finite about all spheres. And so you immediately have a radical paradox that you have a sphere whose periphery is nowhere. You are limited. That's why he would. That's why he was able to treat it as a possible picture. But as soon as something becomes a picture or an image, or even I don't want to say a metaphor, you're treading on a knowledge which violates the kind of deep Neoplatonism, say in Denis the Areopagite, and maybe in Plotinus too, of the apophatic tradition, that you only know what God is. In human beings in their present state only know what God is not, rather than what God is. And so to fix the divine to a particular image, and a sphere is inevitably an image, or a concept. You seem to undermine what you want to talk about. So that's my hesitation. And I certainly don't think that the ionic world periphery for Conrad-Martius is anything like the ultimate horizon. It might be the proper way to fill in our perceptual horizons, where we introduce, as I try to suggest, I think in the stuff there, that the horizon is always a realm of potentiality, waiting actuation. But now if we start thinking then of our perceptual world as a world built upon some sense of nature, as in her light, an actualized potency out of powers which are not present to us now, but are the precondition for everything we do and see, then we have a way of kind of filling in through the ionic world periphery the perceptual horizon. But that wouldn't be God yet, because that's for her created. So that's, I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, so I mean, in particular, the not the aeonic world periphery, but something more like the apyric, the infinite space-time, which would be like a weird kind of space or a weird kind of time, you know. Maybe it's a metaphor, maybe it's an image, but like the infinite sphere, I feel like it at least indicates the place, which is the best we can do with apophatic stuff. We can just give a sign. We can't directly speak about and say anything positive about that thing, except that it's beyond the limits. You know, so I just feel like maybe the aeonic world periphery is the horizon that we can see outside of time, which is the outer, you know, the outer sphere of our 3+1 dimensional universe, or whatever it is. If it's like dimension 4, you know, as she describes using the Minkowski-Einstein stuff, but the idea of like a Pyrrhic space-time, although it's used in the context of the microscopic for the like possible possibilities that Heisenberg's talking about, I think it also applies in the even higher than the aeonic world periphery sense, where it's like maybe even a bigger sphere, the ultimate sphere, because it's the infinite, the infinitum absolutum, as the apeiron of Anaximander and Thales.
Even there, though, we do have the problem of what do we mean by the infinite? The word means non-finite.
Right.
But does it mean the actual infinity of where there's no potentiality? The aperic is typically always a realm of further possible actualizations. Just as, and both in space and time for her. And and eternity is not that. It doesn't mean everlasting at all. And then the aperic as is applied to the potentialities of the intellities actuating the materia, the passive stuff which gets actuated, is endlessly capable of further actualization, but we're still nowhere near a properly theological term.
Yeah, thank you.
That's created. Even the aperic and aeonic is distinctly there's a tight distinction for her between the aeonic and the eternal, as both transcending this passing time. And the getting a hold of the aeonic is hard. I mean, one of the ways that I always thought about it was, and it was kind of suggested in things she said, and certainly other people, that when you think of Hercules, or you think of an event of Jesus having died on the cross, that event, as Bultmann rightly says, is of cosmic significance. You have an age there, something happening in time, which doesn't happen in time. Its meaning is utterly timeless, but still it's not eternity itself. Whitehead had that too somewhere. He had a whole notion of, and I think it comes up in some say with these aeons can be thought of as these endlessly long quasi metaphysical, but more concretely geological ages. And I think those are interesting notions, because they have to be introduced in our self-understanding. That's why I talked about, mentioned earlier, it just struck me as a good thought experiment, how to think of the continuity of human beings from the beginning. She says the Homo sapiens and Homo erectus, obviously from what we know from both the archaeology and the paleontology, they don't look exactly like the modern human being. But she was keen on saying that they were at some point, that once we had a human being, we didn't have evolution. That was one of her interesting claims. You have a kind of essence that, now whether the first moment of Homo erectus was a human being, there's obviously a whole natural discipline, a discipline of natural sciences devoted to that. But she wanted to make it clear that an Aborigine was a human being. You know, there was, and how would we know that? Well, that becomes a quasi-empirical issue. With an explicit form of intellectual consciousness would have to be there. But for us, I think as at least for me, I tend to think of human beings as being kind of beset with the same kind of historical context I'm beset with, and I have trouble imagining what it would be like in the absence of all technology. What it would be like, you know, when you, and this is what the First Nation people can really help us with, to realize your kinship with nature. That's all blinded from us. And that's the message at Copenhagen, not Copenhagen, but in COP26 or whatever it is in Glasgow, and you have the first, Amy Goodman had the First Nation people there the other night, and saying, speaking about Mother Earth and so forth, but all of their relatives, the buffaloes and all these extinct creatures, with whom their myths are suffused as fellow quasi-personal relatives who together were on the adventure of being human. We've lost all that, Now, I'm not saying necessarily that that's bad or good, but I'm inclined to think it's the blindness to our involvement with nature and our kinship with nature has got us in a pickle, a real dangerous pickle, and it's not making a dent in America the way it is throughout the rest of the world. And I don't know what it's going to mean. It becomes, I meditate on this somewhat. Does Conrad-Martius, what would climate change disaster that destroyed the earth and all human consciousness mean for her cosmology? Because she's got it kind of programmed around Christ. She's got the Aeonic world peripheries, a kind of demiurge. Things kick in at the right time, according to salvation history, which is inseparable from cosmological history for her. But are we really, we are capable in our Promethean aspects or Luciferian aspects of destroying the earth and ourselves and all of the forms of consciousness that we know of. Not only through climate change, but through nuclear war. These are real possibilities. They're no longer science fiction. And they're becoming more and more pressing, I think, every day.
I feel like an interesting perspective on these themes, finding in Conrad-Martius this particular kind of integration between the spiritual matters that she's referring to, the Christocentric spiritual matters, and scientific views like there is no evolution, and explaining a kind of descent theory from this perspective, in anthroposophical spiritual science, as it's called, and as well like early Christian theosophy. I just want to show us a little diagram from a book by Hermann Poppelbaum, who is I think he's a student of Steiner. But the anthroposophical spiritual science has, it's worth comparing to the descent theory and the discussion of Darwin and all of these themes in Conrad-Martius. But the anthroposophical view paints a picture of the evolution of humanity and the essence of the human as arriving not just on the natural science view of geological epochs, but rather in a kind of a cosmology that is spiritual. So you'll see down here there's like the Lemurian stage leads us here, and Atlantean stage gives us this divergence, and then the post-Atlantean stage, and that there are cataclysmic events built into this, but as well some of it is a kind of, I don't know if metaphor is the right word, or maybe it's metaphoric, these events of like the separation from the sun, and then the moon departs, this is all true to this is like a representation of Rudolf Steiner's view about the physical evolution to the human. Anyway, I just wanted to show us these cool little diagrams from Poppelbaum's book. And this, it presents a different picture than just the Christian view and the natural science view. There's like different ways of integrating these. So anyway, I just wanted to show us this, but maybe we should hop into the reading. Maybe begin with like any comments we have.
Can I raise one question about what came up just now, like especially referring back to what Bill was talking about? Here's a question I have that I'm thinking about a lot. And there's a whole issue of horizon. There's a whole issue of there's more. That even for there to be something definite, there has to be the background, there has to be the more. So there's that which is determinable, indeterminate, though determinable. And so something that we don't yet know, like the other side, like what underwear you have or whatever, is determinable. And we don't know the limits of that. But here's my question. We can reflect and be aware about exactly what I've just said, that there are individual beings and then there's a horizon that's determinable. Is our awareness of horizon as such, and is that itself present or absent? We're aware of absence that can become present, but what about this whole structure of presence and absence within which in some sense we know we exist, and in some sense we can even form a concept called presence and absence, called totality, called being. We can form these concepts whose content is this totality, most of which is essentially absent, but in what sense is some sort of in what sense is the totality itself present if it inherently involves absence? And I think this may get kind of what Bill's talking about as well, because he keeps saying, well, it's so much up in the air, and it is. And yet we're also saying, yeah, even though so much is up in the air, we can meaningfully and even truthfully have beliefs, have statements, have concepts about this totality, which includes so much being up in the air. In other words, that's the war. You see what I'm asking? Is the concept of being itself present or absent? Is the horizon itself present or absent? And I don't know how to put that. Or is there some third way, some deeper form of awareness that we have through which we grasp things like this? That's just a question I had.
Okay, I'd like to say something about that. As I was thinking about what Jim was talking about and Randy, it seems to me that there are totalities and then there are super totalities. And so I think that when we say we have this concept of totality, it's a finite, limited totality. And there's totality that includes all totalities. There's no way we can get we can say the words, but we can't have a concept of it, I don't think. So I think that, in fact, that's why I was just checking to see when we're going to talk about this thing about heaven and earth. And it's really the next week or next 2 weeks. But there is this, Jim references briefly The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis, which is one of my favorite books. And his picture of the medieval is that there was no doubt to them where God was. They could point to him. They lived amongst God, and it was like near. And so this is really, I mean, it fits next week, next 2 weeks. So I'm sorry, but I have to bring it up here because it seems so powerful to me. Is there a notion of God is entirely embodied? There's some spheres, these hard spheres even, and where they are in their bodies and everything. It's a totality that's embodied, and they can feel it. They can feel this whole chapter 7 next 2 weeks is reflected in the medieval notion of the cosmos, and it's entirely physical and embodied. I don't know, maybe Jeremy doesn't like the word physical. I don't mean exactly physical, but I mean that, you know what I mean? It feels near. It feels like, I don't know how to say it. It feels like you're going to one of those aquariums. What are not aquariums?
Well, he says that they believed heaven was literally up in the sky.
Exactly. They could see it. And they could see the angels moving the planets around. And but the notion that we're talking about in our abstract minds here is something that's beyond that. It's like the world of worlds or something beyond that. We've gone beyond this totality, which is visible, that can be constituted by us in some way, constituted even by the physical world. Anyway, I don't know. I'm not sure if that's an exact response to what Jeremy had to say, but it was on my mind. Right?
Well, there's an element in these myths that could be called hyletic, especially if it's isolated from the narrative structure and the form of the myths, and also the form of experience. You know, this form, like the one on the screen of, you know, us as drawn out in these boxes, you know, can have any kind of density, but it has a certain density, you know, a kind of hyletic material weight and filling. And, you know, these distinctions manifest, certainly they do manifest, and they present themselves in consciousness, but it's not just that there's pure light and pure darkness. There's the penumbra, the anti-penumbra. There's all these different levels or spheres in between the outermost and the innermost of like pure darkness and pure light, right? And we appear at a certain region of a certain density, right? In the same form, the same noetic configuration or constellation can be closer to the center or farther out. And as long as there's that consistency, it can occupy a certain orbit, you know, and it can be farther in or farther out, and all of it could be of a different density, you know, but maybe of the same consistency. So in some of these myths, like in the anthroposophical spiritual science tradition, which integrates a number of these myths into their cosmology, you know, humans have a certain density right now that they didn't have in the like antediluvian period and in other epochs. Like in the Atlantean world, they were able to have ships that floated around because the air was more like water, you know, and that's how they were able to like fly in these spaceships or whatever, you know. I don't know, there's different myths, not just anthroposophy, but there's different myths about density, and that gives us a kind of hyletic dimension to these things that I think is at least interesting to consider. You know, we don't have a perfect total fulfillment of Parmenidean being in the manifestation of a thing, of a being. You know, it has like a degree of being, right? It's a process of becoming, and it has a certain together everything is foozing out as like a kind of density of nature, you know. So
I want to say this kind of someone else want to come in that just support that a bit in terms of what Conrad-Martius is wrestling with. The resurrection of Christ is her focus, and in the sense that there's a transformation of nature. She also has this echoes repeatedly this theme of the new heaven and new earth, and the whole point of the Ionic world periphery is that their nature can take a form that is congenial to spirit without being mere spirit, pure spirit. There's something about the state of being an incarnate spirit which changes the ball game for this kind of religion or this kind of metaphysics. And the destiny of the human being is very similar to the destiny of Jesus of Nazareth, to be in the presence of the Father, which is not a presence anywhere at any time, but at the same time being a incarnate spirit, besides being the eternal Son of God, being an incarnate spirit. And the children of God, all the children of God, have the same destiny of this participating in this transformed nature. And the New Testament writers hint at that, as far as I think she would say, when the from the very post-resurrection miracles, you know, the kind of the absence of the deficiencies or the regrettable inconveniences of being a body. Of course, the New Testament is pretty clear on pretty silent about a lot of the absences of being a body. There's no dwelling on anyone's sickness or incapacitation. You know, it's a fact, but it isn't dwelled on. The having to go to the bathroom and the whole activity of making babies and so forth. That is absent. But there is insistence on this all being blessed, this all being sacramental, this all being a vehicle of grace. And the meaning of that is in the resurrection of everybody. And so there's now, is it a fleshliness? The flesh is a bad word, you know, in the New Testament. The sarx. That word doesn't mean Merleau-Ponty's themes of the touching that Husserl has. It doesn't have to do with the way we can be in one another by being outside of one another through caressing one another. We can feel one another's feeling in a way we can't feel anything when we touch a rock surface or anything. There is an endlessly transformed version of bodiliness into an elaborate transformation of flesh in the resurrected Christ, and that's our destiny. But how are we to understand this? Or maybe, and the modern option is to dismiss it. She's keen on establishing a view of nature which makes that possible. That the glorified, as we say, Christ, because it was a glorified body, and there's all sorts of strange conversations that go on after the resurrection. When Mary Magdalene, I guess it is, touches him or wants to touch him and hug him, she says, "Don't touch me, I've not ascended to the Father." That means she can't really touch him and embrace him until she is with him in the presence of the Father. I mean, it's one way you could read that, you know. So there are this theme of this peculiar kind of, and I say peculiar because it's so out of off the radar screen, I think, of most contemporaries. But it seems to me the New Testament is riddled with this theme, and the whole theology of what used to be called eschatology, the last things, is based on that eschatology is based on this theme of the bodiless being transformed and resurrected. And I think the anthroposophists and others, Rudolf Steiner in particular, you know, kind of sense that. But you find this scattered throughout the history of religions. You know, you have the shamans were people who typically were transformed by smoking dope or you know, inhaling something or going into a kind of trance. But they got in touch with another world. These are all kind of you know, historical religious kind of adumbrations of this theme. And I think Randy's pointing to them through the anthroposophy. I hope you say it. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but I just want to say that it's not a I don't say it's an unwelcome theme. It's just that it's so weird. And my first introduction was Eliade, was about these shifting horizons. I think I might have mentioned to you, my first was a seminar on mystical experience. And the room was filled with a smell of pot. It was back in about 1962 or 63. And everybody seemed to be high for me. I mean, really. And I was a young man recently out of the seminary and interested in discovering, that I didn't reminding himself I no longer had a vow of chastity. And I remember this young woman who had this shared with us, that she was a mystic, and she saw all of us in auras, and she was a gorgeous human being, and she started describing the auras of each of us. She never got around to describing mine, regrettably, but this was my introduction to Eliade and this weird stuff, but this was, phenomenologically, she was seeing something. Of course, she was on dope, but it was still interesting. And that theme of people having auras, by the way, is recounted by lots of SoPheRE people, not only in history, but in modernity. I've bumped into people, someone recently who saw everybody with an aura, and she was stone sober. So,
boy, Jim, do I remember that? But it wasn't marijuana that did it. You had to do LSD or peyote to actually see your auras. Then you can get the full color spectrum.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting theory of sacramentalism, because when you think of the transubstantiation, you ascribe, the work it out in propositions for a Catholic, and this was, of course, a key issue with Luther, but that Christ is really present. Now there you have another interest. She wasn't Catholic, Conrad-Martius. She was kind of a evangelical, we'd say, but Pentecostal. But there is a Benedictine by the name of it won't come right now. I'll come back later. But I remember I wrote an article on his work, but it was Eliade had talked about it too, that there is in the Mass, for example, you have an enactment, and you have in the sacrament of the Mass, of the Eucharist, you have the real presence of Christ. Christ is present. He's really, now that's interesting for our phenomenology of time, because here you have this sense of time is not being a now which passes and is gone forever. This is an eternally valid now. It never loses, fades off into mere retentions and vague memories. And it is actually present, really present, to use Bill's words, really present in every enactment of the Mass throughout the whole world. Now there you have a metaphysical problem with space and time. And that is the same event that happened on Calvary. And it happens at every Mass, and it has its validity is there, and somehow the historical reality is represented actually ontologically, really. So but for the modern, this is as crazy as some of the anthroposophic stuff that Randy's referring to. It doesn't fit anywhere. But there is an interesting reference to we can't accept time. If we're going to be Christians in this way, we can't accept a lot of versions of time and space. And that's what caught my fantasy or my imagination with her. How do you believe these things given such and such kind of premise? And you realize, well, the premises might have to change. But but then when you get to the presence of the Father, who's never not present anywhere, or the presence of God, the Godhead, never not present anywhere, you get more into the issues that Jeremy and Bill were raising. What sort of thing is this? Well, it's not anything at all. That's why the Buddhists get closer sometimes.
So I'd like to, first of all, Jim, I'm going to send you a small email about Eucharist, Christ, and the moon, but that have occurred to me. But I want to get to page 210, and this is relevant to what you were just saying, where Randy brought this section up before about the ganz andere, and so I think it's interesting to think about the phenomenology of the alien, and so we have to think about what the alien is, how we recognize the alien, and we always recognize it relative to what's familiar. So it's unfamiliar. And so this is where the temporal comes in, because with the familiar, we can see, if you like, the flow of time. We can not only see it, we can predict it. It's familiar. But with the alien, there's an interruption in time. And we can't see this flow. We can't, it's a discontinuous event. And so it's easy then to imagine this alien time, if you like, as, well, I don't want to say anything more about it, except that we have to immediately recognize that it's an alien time. It doesn't abide by the same flow that the familiar abide by. And so it could be eternal. It might just have its own time, a parallel time. We can't tell, but it's the discontinuity that's important. And so we lack this sense of a continuous flow of time. And so it establishes itself, it shows itself as a different time.
Oh. Well, the medievals wrestled with that version of that, Bill, in trying to think about the time of angels and the kind of knowledge, because they weren't in passing time, and they existed as pure spirits. Now, of course, our imaginations kind of go falter there, but it's interesting that it's a necessary, at least you have to be able to open the door to think about that if you're going to, and this was, and I think this is the direction of most enlightened Christians, is to think of their existence post-mortem as something like the medieval angel, because they're utterly pure spirits, and their bodiliness is gone, but they are still conscious, or they are conscious in a new way, and they don't have the absolute ontological kind of temporality, which is a non-temporality, which is eternity of God. So they felt that they had to make a distinction in those three kinds of times at least, and that would have been more like what Conrad-Martius mean by the aeonic time of the entelechies. The angels in some way become something like, there's some symmetry between her notion, the way the essence entelechies are temporal, and by not being in time, and what the medievals tried to say the angels were like. They also had not empirical knowledge because they didn't have perceptual knowledge, but they knew all that we could come up with in perception by a kind of a priori knowledge, which is interesting. So the question arises, what does an angel see when it appears to Mary? Say as in the Gospel of Luke. And how does it see? Or what does it make present in the absence of eyes? And so forth. So these are probably disputed questions in some medieval texts that I know nothing about, but they're if you're going to be, follow this out, these are important issues. And certainly, how does it, what is the kind of, the issue that we are never not bodied, incarnate in eternity becomes a fascinating issue. And that was what Conrad-Martius was an important issue for her. Matt, where are you in Germany right now?
I'm the closest big city is Bielefeld, but it's
Oh, yeah.
sort of northeast, northwest, about 2 hours north of Cologne.
Do you know anything of the Bielefelder School of Feminist Sociology or feminism?
No, I don't.
Oh, it's a wonderful school. My wife was part of them. My ex-wife was part of that. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Claudia von Berloff. She was taught there.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I have to check into it.
Oh, yeah. It's just, but the whole theme of woman's work, you know, and the critique of patriarchy is very robust.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of that.
That's interesting because he's right next to Paderborn, which is where the Center for the History of Women Philosophers and Scientists, one of the hubs of the study of Conrad-Martius, Edith Stein, and Gerda Walther is.
Oh, well, there you go. And what are you
That's
doing?
about an hour away.
What are you doing, Pat? What are you doing in Bielefeld? Or
I'm writing a dissertation at the moment. This is sort of the daily grind of writing a dissertation.
what is it about?
It's on Aristotle and Husserl.
We.
Yeah, I just got done with the Aristotle part, and now I'm switching to the Husserl part. So
Bob Sokolowski's been teaching that a course on Aristotle and Husserl now the last couple of years.
that sounds like a lot of fun. There's more parallels than I thought that there were before, before I started to work.
Yeah, it's trying to work out metaphysics, you know, what it would mean. Well,
Yeah.
there's a lot of Aristotle in Husserl. There is. You know.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I was just working with, not to take us too far afield, but the sort of like a kind of categoriality and perception in Aristotle, and how that sort of kind of transfers over to some of the genetic phenomenology. That's the direction I'm going now.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Shaler theme that I like here, Aristotle has that marvelous theme of if we're responsible for our acts, we're responsible for what appears to us as good. And that has a lot to do with the habitus, you know, the perceptual habits and everything. But it's Shaler's question of what are the moral preconditions of knowing? You know, and that the New Testament theory that only, or claim and doctrine that only the pure can see. And that, say, then in the later 20th century with the Marcel and Lavelle, you know, if we are burdened down by our havings, we have face an obstacle for being who we are. The tension between being and having.
Mm.
So the whole notion of authentic knowing and integrity and clarity of vision is a moral matter in Aristotle even, you know. If we're responsible for our actions, we're responsible for what appears to us as good, because how we've acted determines how we see the world. And this is what we're talking about, I think, in part today, how we see the world and how many of our actions are not of our own doing, but are there because what Hegel would call objective spirit, you know, how we can keep nuclear weapons going, how we can support an economic oligarchy which calls the shots. So we no longer have the distinguished senator from Montana or West Virginia. We have the distinguished senator from Exxon ruling the country. And what else can we do? Capitalism is the air we breathe. And socialism is such a horrible, devilish, demonic, Stalinistic thing that, you know, who would not be indignant at the very mention of it? I'll stop there.
You know,
sorry,
it's,
because I just joined a bit later. Did I get that you had a question of what did Angel see when he talked to Mary? Was it the correct that I? Because I might have the answer to that, because in a Catholic Horizon, I just happen to have this. So the angels are servants and they are sent by the God, and they are purely spiritual beings, and they have their own mind, and they have their own will, and they can see God eye to eye, and they are more perfect than anything else, and they also were mentioned in the Old Testament, right? So when the angel was guiding Tobias, I don't know if you know the story, right? And he actually made Tobias, that Tobias was able to see. So I don't think that's anything in this question. We all have, according to Catholic faith, our own, each of you, you too, me too, a guardian angel who sees all our deeds and that we will render. So the question I don't think was quite relevant, right? So your question is my answer to that.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's interesting in and of itself. And we have the other fellow who, I forget who it was, who wrestled with the angel. Who was it? What ladder when he was up and down there? That New Testament, Old Testament hero, Hebrew Bible hero, who wrestled with the angel. So he certainly had to have a body to wrestle. But it still poses, if you don't, it means our epistemic vocabulary has to be somewhat readjusted, because what we mean by seeing or even perceiving. And so, and the medievals, that I know of, were pretty well familiar. Well, they didn't see in terms of ocular vision. And if they wrestled, if one of our old Hebrew Bible heroes wrestled with the angel, it wasn't, it wasn't a matter of sinews and muscles and bones. There must have been necessarily, but of course, I don't think you find in the Hebrew Bible the speculation on a notion of pure spirit, and nor in the New Testament is it very clearly made. But certainly in later reflection on it, there had to be a form of knowing, a form of interaction, a form of communication, but it wasn't bodily, as we know. It wasn't fleshly. So they came up with a different theory of knowledge for angels. That wasn't a matter of physical, of perception. We can't say that they, if we were going to introduce things like shapes and colors and so forth, what would that mean for a spirit in the absence of bodies? And so that became a priori. They were never without a knowledge, apparently, of the physical world in some sense, but it was a purely, it's the way we know the importance of truth. We never learned it. We never learned truth. There's nothing in the world that's going to instruct us about what truth is in terms of an object of perception. But we know that we may not, that it's at our peril that we don't follow that impulse or that mandate or that obligation. And that we know the difference between is and ought is not a matter of physical perception or perceptual content. We have something like a prioris too. And we have, as Jeremy was suggesting and Bill too earlier, we begin with a knowledge of being. That's the problem, as I've mentioned before, with Husserl's transcendental reduction for me. He seems to think we can get away by bracketing our natural attitude, which is seems to be a knowledge of being. And I think that maybe he makes it too easy. He never gets away from being. But that's why he's able to single out consciousness as more true being, or the absolute being, the truly true being. But maybe he can say that because he's never not known being. And he never really did reduce it. But that's Husserlian heresy. So I'm just throwing that out as something I'm thinking about. I've talked too much today. Sorry.
I want to bring up this one theme before we finish up at some point. I feel like it's worth mentioning because I've been thinking about this a lot. There's a way of thinking of these higher dimensions or other densities or angelic realms or distinctions between like the angels and the principalities and the thrones, or the different koshas in Vedic literature, for instance, in terms of body in the sense of three-dimensional stereometric form. And this is something that comes from especially Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, but I think you can find it in other places as well. There's this image of, I don't know the source exactly in Gurdjieff and or Ouspensky, but if you think of body as a three-dimensional figure, but you think of it as like a point, then or if you reduce it to being a point and consider the the path that it takes as being like the line of that point, then you have like the familiar timeline, right, or the world line, the kind of like Einsteinian concept. So then if you think of this line as being like the thing that spans the three-dimensional and the four-dimensional as being like a fragment of this, full from birth to death, full path of like a seed or a water droplet from cloud to ground. Think of that as like the four-dimensional path that it takes. You could then conceive of a kind of not a line, but a plane of other possible lines that it could take, a different path from seed to tree, or from cloud to ground, different paths. So these are like different possible world lines as being not the line, but the plane. In other words, the next higher dimension. So in this schema, it would correspond to like a fifth dimension. And this is just like a thought experiment, right? And then a sixth dimension would be to conceive of the like time solid instead of a time line or a time plane of other possibilities being actualized. This is now other possible possibilities being actualized. You can think of it this way. So then that would be the sixth dimension. And then Ouspensky and or Gurdjieff ends the narrative at the sixth dimension, putting emphasis on the idea of the six being this ancient story of there are six dimensions. Now, I think that there are more dimensions. I mean, conceivably there could be, infinitely many in the countably infinite sense. But, this is at least an interesting way of conceiving like these you can think of them like superlunary spheres or differences in regions of possibility, beyond that which is actualized in the consciousness that we inhabit. So when like it's Jacob who wrestles with an angel, it could be that that's like the, when we do a thought experiment, we think about not just different possible paths we might take, but other possible universes, or just different routes we might actually take. These are kind of like operations happening in a higher dimensional aspect of our imagination, where we take the object and we move it around, see the other sides of it that might be, and have partial fulfillments, of what it might be. So anyway, it's just like a little thought experiment. Usually it's like tied to the idea of a seed or a raindrop.
Well, let me just support that in one respect. I think as phenomenologists, we have to be able to start with things that we all see together, and if we just to support that, I think we're all familiar with how when we know another person, another mind, another incarnate spirit. We know that there is, we use a sense of spatiality there. Even Husserl's term empathy is feeling within or feeling in. And so, but we know, but the perception of another person is not anything like a brain surgeon's, because we're going into, in some sense, an analogous sense, we're going inside that body. But we're not looking for any bodies. We're not having undertaking a surgical. We have a sense of another dimension. We're feeling in, and we're coming up with a different kind of within, because we know that as another person, they experience themselves as having an exterior and an interior. But when we're coming in, when we know another person, and it's a radical simple, it's a simple act, but it's radically significant. And 20th century philosophy has been dwelled on it. There is if you want, an absolute interiority, an absolute within, an absolute inner. And it's nothing spatial. We go, and so this would be something like what I think Randy's referring to, with a plane, the plane of the other consciousness. It's, first of all, it seemed we were led into something, but it turns out we're not, nothing to find if we don't leave that plane. If we think if you think knowing another mind is going inside the other person's head, as people say in modern Americanese, you're never going to meet another person. What's in your head? If that's what you're looking for, what's in your head, you're not talking about me, my thoughts, or anything. And if you go about it in terms of finding out what's in my head, people say, I can't get my head around that. Or my head was bursting with thought, or something. There's this kind of imperialistic image of brain science and skulls taking over our first person experiences of ourselves and our second person and third person experiences of others. But I think this is a useful way of getting at how life is soaked with this something like different dimensions. And when I get to hearing about this distinctive dimension of quantum physics, I'm in trouble there, because unless you have a somewhat Marxian perspective, where you're entering in a time that also is a creation of space, a new kind of space. Is it really in time? Are the quantum phenomena really in space and time? And I hear some of the talk I hear suggests no, that's where space and time begin. And so, but I think more clear for phenomenological reflection is the wonderful event of perceiving another consciousness, loving another person, talking with another person. We're going, when the other person unbears her heart, his heart, what is that? It's nothing like neurosurgery or any kind of surgical work. Well, what are we talking about then? And how much is it a dismissible, irrelevant, sloppy metaphor, or whether it is in metaphysics? And the other stuff is relatively superficial. I won't answer that question. And it's time for, my dog is telling me it's time for a walk.
Well, maybe this is a productive aporia that we can leave off on.
I just wanted to say real quick, if I can, when you were speaking about Uspensky and Gurdjieff, I mean, it's my impression that they implicit, if not explicit, they're basically saying that the material, our body, sort of like holds us back from experiencing, whether it's a fourth or fifth or sixth dimension. And, you know, I mean, there were many other Russian mystics and philosophers such as Soloviev and Florinsky, who talk about how that's why you get this variety of people's experiences when they do experience something mystical, because to kind of quote Florinsky, he's saying that what happens is you just experience have a mystical experience on some kind of level that you can relate to. Therefore, that explains why some people, the images are flickering, others are vibrant colors, others are audible, and it just depends. And to say that the variety, because there doesn't seem to be any salience to that, doesn't mean that it's like, you know, just in someone's imagination. It's just that how do you translate reality from a fourth, fifth, or sixth dimension to someone who's living in a third dimension. So I don't know if that.
Well, it's a good analogy because that's precisely, you have, I mean, let's say Dan Sahabi and Sean Gallagher and so forth. That's the problem. They're trying to negotiate how the language of brain science and neurophysiology and church, I mean, the whole modern analytic philosophy too. How do you translate? How do you talk about firing neurons and a resolve to stop drinking? I mean, are they really reducible or translatable? And of course, we can be dissatisfied with saying, well, one's a necessary condition for the other, but it's not the sufficient condition, and they're not commensurate. But that's still, you'd want to be able to say that. But that's what a good part of the last 50 years in philosophy and in the English-speaking world, anyhow, has been puzzling over that. So I think there is a, I don't know whether it's commensurable, those different realms of, first of all, objects, and that's the big divide. That's the first person experience of ourselves versus our experience of objects. Sally, did that help at all, or is that?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
In Plato's Republic, right after the cave, he talks about these 5 sciences, before the end of book 7 of the Republic, where he talks about dialectic. And he talks about these 5 sciences. They're arithmetic, geometry, and then he says to Glaucon, and then wouldn't astronomy be next? And then he takes it back and he says, no, there's a missing science that is something we don't think about. And then the next one's astronomy. And that missing science, he says, is stereometry, the science of 3-dimensional bodies. And anyway, it's a really interesting maneuver that Plato writes it this way, where he takes that back. There's a few authors who've emphasized this fact, but it's interesting because that's the science of 3-dimensional solids, the things that we are most proximate to, even if we occupy somewhere between the 3rd and 4th dimension as our normal habitus. But 3-dimensional objects like the Poland Spring water bottle, is the famous example in phenomenology that we're always invoking. And it's exactly that which we overlook, according to Plato. We literally skip over it and go from the science of 2-dimensionality, the higher geometry, to the science of 3-dimensional things moving around in space, which is how he talks about astronomy. So anyway, it's just this cool little thing I always think about in connection with stereometry, since we bring up bodies.
Matt has to solve for Aristotle's use of equivalent words for something like consciousness, if there is anything.
I don't know. I'm not sure that there is. It's funny. I've been thinking about this actually. It seems like Aristotle externalizes the internal. I don't think his theory of perception is or something like that, something that we would think of as conscious, is like a sort of strict materialism or empiricism. Like he's trying to talk about what it's like to perceive, but he does that with, I think, a typical Aristotelian framework. So he doesn't, I don't know that maybe common sense is the closest he gets to consciousness, but I don't think he, at least off the top of my head, has a word for consciousness.
No, I think you might be right. But I do think he's got a cogito argument in either in the De Cielo or De Sensu or somewhere in one of those texts.
Yeah, that would make sense to me. Yeah. No,
he really does. I think it's a neglected study. I would think it'd be a good chapter for a dissertation. On the Cartesian, the Aristotelian cogito. It really
that does sound very interesting.
If I find, I know where I have it somewhere, but it's quite intriguing. So if you want me to send it to me, write me and I'll look.
Please, yeah.
So just hart@indiana.edu and then I can send it back.
Okay, that sounds good.
No. I gotta go. So is my dog. Good seeing everybody.
Yeah,
See
let's
you.
wrap it up. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
So much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Bye now.
Bye, bye, bye.
Bye-bye.